The workshop we're going to look at today is the landscape of anxiety. It will map out how students will respond when they are anxious. And I think it's fair to say, not just post-COVID, but in general, students have a lot more stresses to contend with than ever before, perhaps. And it needs to be made clear that when we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about an effect on a student's brain that may compromise the ability of that student to manage situations and their behavior with the best possible skill set that they might have when they're feeling very calm and settled. To do this, we're going to have a look at a graph, if you'll permit me. It's a graph that has, over here is the elevation, and here is distance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a graph of a landscape, and it'll have hills and valleys, and the hills and valleys will give you some indication as to the heightened stress as we go up a hill, or the lowering stress as we go down into a valley of behavior. Our responses to highly elevated stress and anxiety or anger are essentially the same. For all human beings, we have the same responses in our brain and in our neurotransmitters in our brain and at a psychological level. How we respond to those is a learned behavior. So as an adult, we may not get to the point of a tantrum, but we may nevertheless feel that same depth of stress, but we're able to manage it. Bear in mind that this entire workshop for you as teacher aides is working on children, and they don't have the same cognitive skills or abilities that we do to manage their stress or even identify their stress. So on this side, as we go up in height, we're going to increase in stress or anxiety. So you can see how we've moved up from calm to annoyed, agitated, angry, and possibly enraged. Now, that's actually just elevated emotion. So whilst enraged is a good way to depict that for us here in this exercise, it needs to be noted that it doesn't necessarily have to be an angry emotion that we're developing here. It could be calm, having a bit of fun, quite a great deal of pleasure, really enjoying yourself, and completely lost the plot. And with children, that does happen. My daughter's birthday party was a classic example of everyone getting a bit silly because their emotional state started to get a little too high and a little imbalanced. Down the bottom of this graph, it'll represent the time or the duration of the event. So along here, whilst it says distance, and I suppose for the landscape it would be distance, but for our exercise, it's going to be time or duration. Now, we could imagine that to be any period of time. It could be minutes, it could be hours, it could be days, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could even be years. And you'll see as we progress through this just how that may map out for children. So I've just moved those over to the side so we can see those elevated emotions. And on this graph, I'm just going to paint the first part of our landscape. It's those lovely green fields, these marigolds and daffodils and birds chirping and little brooks going through, little rivers as it were, lovely green zone. In that space, we're very calm, our normal functioning reasoning will take place. We're feeling very much in control. It's a happy space. Above that, if we go up in the mountain range, we'll find that things get a bit colder as we go higher up. And at that point, we start to lose that lovely sense of control, and we start feeling that slippery sense of control, a little bit of frustration perhaps. And we start to test choices to see if they work. We start to feel as though we're not completely in control. We're not able to make as many good decisions. And often we see that. We can actually feel that emotion developing. Above that, as we go up in the landscape, it gets quite cold, quite windy, sleety, rainy, snowy, blizzardy. This is where our reasoning starts to get compromised. Our brain is starting to shut down, our executive function is shutting down, and we're starting to kick into that fight or flight response. Now, we're still able to see this, but we're less able to do anything about it. Certainly in this zone, we can see this is happening and we're able to pull it back if we need to. Up here, we're starting to feel ourselves going, and it's hard to pull ourselves back. And again, I talk about ourselves because that makes a great analogy for what we're talking about here, but we're really talking about children who are less able than us to pull their emotions back. Above the blizzard zone, I would call the red zone or the crisis zone. It's impulsive and explosive behavior. And if you think of a child, this is high as it gets. Something will break. Usually it's them rearranging something in the bedroom, or they're shouting or swearing. It's quite an emotional high point. It would be nice if we started and finished our day like that. As a teacher aide, I doubt that you do. And as a teacher, I know that that's my goal. I would aspire for that, but that's not always the case. In actual fact, what's probably more likely to happen in a day is probably something more like this. But I imagine these bumps and these troughs will happen many times through a day. But for the purpose of the exercise, I've just drawn one. So you can see that there was a little bit of a trigger here. Something didn't quite work out. I calmed down a little bit, and then another trigger pushed me up. And I'm now in this space of slippery sense of control, feeling a little bit frustrated. But then I've calmed down, pardon me, and I feel, oh, everything is good again. And so our day trundles through. Can I ask you to spend a few moments just drawing how it might look for you? For some people, they may hold that emotion in for a long time, holding the emotion in, saying, no, I'm not stressed. There's no problem at all. There's no problem at all. But it is a human psychology that there is a problem. You've just managed to quell it or to hold it in. The problem with that is, of course, at some point, are going to have to navigate when the emotion does hit that high point. My little humorous moment in this workshop is I'll use that very same graph and I will say, hey, what do you think might be the graph for the typical Australian male? And whilst I think it's an unfair statement, the humour is the Australian male holds their emotions in, and then there's a big burst. And we all at this point go, well, where did that come from? I didn't see that coming. It's important to note, humour aside, that that's a very real thing. And we need to be well aware that there is the potential for this curve to happen in this way. So let's map this out again. Here's our graph. And now we need to start to look at, well, what could be some of the solutions to this? Because in a classroom, the teacher is tracking and getting annoyed and agitated. And so too could be some of those students. And at some point, the teacher will ask you as a teacher aide to, would you please take Tyrone outside and could you just work with him out there, please? Because I think he's starting to upset the class or he's disrupting our class. Or could you take that group, the skills group out, please? Because they don't work very well together in a whole class setting. For a teacher aide, that's a tall order because they're asking you to take the higher end of the behaviour management strategies out of the room and manage them with what may be a skill set that hasn't been well provisioned or trained. And my personal reason for being a part of the Australian Teacher Aide is because I believe teacher aides are not given enough opportunities to be well trained.